Dear colleagues, greetings from Armenia. First of all, I am so grateful to my friends Yanina Rier and Vitalina Girny that they insisted on my participation since I was not sure if my topic fits with a geographical frame of this conference. But after assurance from the organizers that this paper will be interesting for our participants, I'm happy to talk to you about this side of my research. So I'm giving you now a world in a transition zone of Eastern Europe and Western Asia. Keep in mind that we are back in the turbulent times of the Mongol invasions and the general decline of the Eastern European states. In such a dark age, something truly extraordinary in a cultural and educational sense happened on a territory of Greater Armenia as the newly founded Franciscan and Dominican orders were sent to the vast territories of the Mongol Empire with diplomatic and evangelical missions. On their way, they based also at this historically important crossroad between Europe and Asia. In a small Armenian village located on a Silk Road called Karna, some of the most educated Dominicans of a time, we know the names of few, Bartholomew of Bologna, Peter of Aragon, John of Swinford, etc., alumni of the renowned European universities, together with a dozen archimandrites from the first university of medieval Armenia in Galadzor, established an Uniate monastery in 1330, and through the mutual intellectual exchange gave a start to a grandiose project of translations from Latin and the composition of new philosophical, theological, and linguistic tractates, which lasted decades. Thus, the European medieval educational traditions and teaching materials were adopted after some modifications by the headmasters of Galadzor and Tatev universities into the university curriculums. Now let's get closer. First question, how and for what purpose these monks reached Armenia, if we are talking about migration of intellectuals? The mission of Franciscan and Dominican orders was to preach, as the name Ordo Praedicatorum says. And the papacy, who sent them, was deciding at this time which countries have higher priority, constantly redirecting these movements. So in this sense, this was a targeted migration. The monks themselves were very enthusiastic about their mission. At first, the monks were solely the ambassadors of papacy at the court of Mongols, crossing vast areas, but they constantly sent reports to Rome or Avignon from their long journeys about the state of nations and possibilities to organize a mission. We have evidences from the correspondences with Popes Gregory IX and Innocentius IV, but Dominicans were present in Armenia since 1245. But after 1263, when the Catholic Church got a complete tax exemption, Yarlik, and the permission to preach freely from Ilkhanat to China, the monastic orders flooded the Near East and Asia, establishing their dioceses. Such allowances were also given from Armenian kings of Cilicia, since they were diplomatic enough to make a pact with Mongols and keep their independence. For example, we know about the letter of Armenian King Hetun I from the year 1265, addressed to the head of the Dominican order in Trier, Germany, granting allowance to establish a constant mission within Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia. As you can see, the missionaries were also invited, not only sent to Armenia. As a starting date of constant presence of the Catholic monastic orders in Armenia and perpetual Armenian Latin contacts, we may take the year 1279, when a Franciscan monastery was founded in Sebaste. You can see on the map. Please have a look at it. The crossed keys represent Catholic metropolis in Armenia and the region. Also, you may see the list and locations of medieval monastic schools and universities of Armenia. We'll get to them later. In 1318, the whole mission in Asia was given by Pope John the 22nd to Dominicans. So from that point, we see mostly Dominican activity on the territory of Armenia. The first Catholic bishop of India, Dominican Jordanus Catalanus de Severac, who spent the winter of 1320 in Armenia, reports that by this time around 4,000 Armenians were converted into Catholicism. The number is maybe a bit exaggerated. In 1330, an archdiocese was established in the metropolis of Ilkhanat, Sultaniye, ruling over 40 monasteries, some of them in the cities inhabited with Armenians, Tiflis, Tabriz, Maragha. But the most interesting part of Armeno-Latin relations begins in the year 1428, when the headmaster of Armenian University in Galadzor, Yesayan Nechetsi, sends one of his brilliant students, Archimandrite Johannes Kernetsi, to the Dominican bishop of Maragha, Bartholomew of Bologna. The intention of his delegation was to know more about the plans of Catholic missionaries and to establish a friendly ecumenic contact. But things almost never go as planned, right? The disciple of Yesayan Johannes had an inexhaustible thirst for knowledge and was inspired with the idea of possible true church union. So he decided to stay by Catholics and change aside. According to a historian from the first half of 17th century, Galanus, he mastered his Latin within just a year and taught Dominican brothers Armenian as well. He invited Bishop Bartholomew to move his diocesan chair to Armenian village on the Silk Road in nowadays Nakhichevan, Karna, where his uncle, a rich trader, built a monastery for them. So Dominicans, of course, happily took this opportunity because this region on the international highway was very promising for their mission. Bartholomew died in 1443, and Johannes took over this congregation, consisting of Dominicans and 12 other archimandrites of Armenian Church. He traveled to Rome, got the papal blessing as the head of a new order called Ordo Armenorum, which was directly responsible to the headmaster of Dominican order and had at his maximal expansion 52 monasteries in Armenia, Georgia, and Crimea with 700 monks. Let's talk now about the most prominent Dominicans in Armenia, what we know about them. We possess several historical sources and most importantly works of a Dutch researcher from the first half of 20th century, himself Dominican, Vardan Aslanyan, whom I deeply admire, though I took his arguments critically and have found some mistakes. So in the course of my research, I identified the following figures. First, Bartholomew of Bologna, also called Parvus the Younger, Dominican Bishop of Maragha, died in Kurna in 1343. Alushan and Audenrein insist that he should have been a student of Thomas Aquinas himself, which might well be, since Aquinas taught in Bologna when Bartholomew was in his student years. He authored important philosophical theological works such as Dialectic, which presents the logical systems from Aristotle to Thomas Aquinas, On Five Universals, Book of Sermons, on Hexaemeron, translations of which we have in dozen manuscripts of Matenadaran, Armenian Institute for Ancient Manuscripts. Another eminent person was Spaniard Peter from Aragon, a Franciscan grammarian and an outstanding translator. I'm citing Galanus. Peter from Aragon, together with Archimandrites Jacob and Johannes, worked so hard on translations from Latin into Armenian that the scriptures were uncountable. So imagine the scope of their translation project. The most important translation, of course, was of Summa Theologicae, this monumental work of Thomas Aquinas, which shaped the medieval scholastic thought. According to textual analysis of some researchers, the Latin source for translation is similar to medieval copies written in Spain. So Most probably, Peter from Aragon brought the complete copy of Summa Theologicae for the translation from his homeland. Let me note that this translation was completed in the year 1347, 500 years earlier than to any other European language. Could you believe it? In some remote Armenian village to an Oriental language, it's indeed something extraordinary. You may see the front page of his original translation in Borgiani Armeni collection of Vatican. It's in the chat. Peter from Aragon composed also commentaries on categories and De Interpretatione of Aristotle and numerous theological tractates. We know also the names of John from Florence, later Bishop of Tiflis, Franciscan Frate Portius, among the translators, whose name we see in postscripts of Armenian manuscripts of that time. But I want to tell you more about the John of Swinford and bring him as an example of highly educated intellectual. He is called also John from England in manuscripts. Alden Rijn, in one of his articles, calls him an Irishman without showing any proof, maybe because the article was printed in the Swiss Journal of Irish Studies, Hibernia. But it's impossible for two reasons. First of all, there was no Dominican province in Ireland. Secondly, that's true, there is a village, Swinford, in Ireland, but the name derives from the 18th century. So it's definitely the Swinford in England, located between Warwick and Leicester, which is mentioned in the Saxonian map from the 10th century. After a short research on Dominican provinces of England, I have detected that Dominicans of these provinces in 14th century were attached to the University of Oxford. You may check this fact yourself in a book of O'Carroll called The Educational Organization of the Dominicans in England and Wales between 1221 and 1348. The Dominicans of these provinces had a free entry to the general education course, Studium Generale, and Studium Provinciale, including 7 liberal arts, philosophy, and theology. Here we go, a qualified Oxford alumnus in Armenia at the beginning of the 14th century. I should mention his compilations from Summa Theologica, which I studied during my PhD in a library of Tübingen University. There is a collection of 105 Armenian manuscripts. Another important question that I heard during the opening speeches, and I think you keep asking to every speaker during this conference, how these foreigners were seen in Armenia and what was their perception of Armenians. I think it's obvious that when in medieval times Catholic Church established the diocese in an Oriental Christian land, the sole purpose of this enterprise is to unite the specific national church to papacy. I'm not an expert, but I think similar processes were common as well on the territory of Eastern Europe between Catholicism and Orthodoxy in the late medieval times. For missionaries, pagans, and in their imagination, schismatic Christians were the same, but one should admit that the intellectual exchange and knowing a new culture was for high importance also for Catholic party, at least in the first decades of relations. We have many historical evidences that the headmasters of Armenian universities were invited to Kurna for theological debates, and there was a constant correspondence between Yezayan Nachetsi and his student Johannes Kernetsi even after his conversion into Catholicism. Armenian side met the Catholic missionaries with an interest and open arms, since their arrival gave them hope of liberation with the help of the West. Intellectually, Western tradition was very attractive for Armenians. The tractates of scholastic thinkers were copied in Armenian monasteries in dozens. Tatev University even bought once a whole library collection from a close in Uniate monastery. According to Giovanni de Serpos, Gregory of Tatev, the headmaster of Tatev University, similar figure in the history of Armenian thought like Thomas Aquinas in the West, was a great admirer of Western thinkers and was citing them often in his tractates. The only thing that was annoying the Armenian cycles was the radical proselytism of Catholic missionaries. The Metropolitan of Munich, Stefan Orbelian, in his work from 1302, named Refutation Against Theophysites or Catholics, calls the radical activity of missionaries on Armenian soil a terminal illness like a cancer. To sum up the adequate reaction of Armenian side, I will cite the letter of Yezayan Nechetsi from 1328 to Bishop Matthew of Tabriz. When some Catholic, Greek, or Syriac person comes to you, no matter archimandrite, priest, or a layman, receive him with all honors as a brother and servant of our Lord, and rejoice with them over the unity of the Church. But when they set themselves against you or try to dissuade you from your faith or from the teachings of others, do not welcome them as followers of the Christ, but rather as troublemakers of a church, opponents of truth, and wolves in sheep's clothing. And that was the case. Catholic missionaries were preaching openly in Armenian cities, calling Armenian church heretical, refusing its sacraments, baptizing Armenian Christians, and ordinating Armenian priests anew. Exactly this extremism was the main reason of the fiasco of Catholic missions in Armenia. Later on, in the 80s of the 14th century, when the Catholic mission went absolutely out of control, we see extreme measures against them. The head of Tatev University, Johannes Orotnetsi, with another archimandrite, Mahakia from Crimea, were traveling from monastery to monastery, setting inquisitions, capturing, torturing to death, and incarcerating the missionaries and their followers, according to historical evidences, even boiling some of them in bronze cauldron. So the Catholic mission ended up with failure. The Mongol Tartar invasions and the repressions from the side of Armenian Church had their effect on the Uniatic congregation. By the end of the 14th century, their numbers sunk to just 100. Their literary activity ceased. After the death of Tamerlan or Timur in 1405, the completely Islamized Mongol Khanate closed the gates for the Catholic missions. The monastery in Kurna existed till the middle of 18th century when Persian Shah Nadir forced them to convert into Islam or leave the country. The last Armenian Dominican died in 1794 in the monastery of Ancona, Italy. Since we are short in time, I will try now to quickly represent the influence of Dominicans on the university system of Armenia. First of all, the main theological works of scholastic authors were translated into Armenian and included in the curriculum of Armenian universities. We have several manuscripts in Matenadaran, which are actually anthologies of Latin tractates. During my research, I brought together and edited the long list of available Latin works in Armenian, which can be found in medieval manuscripts. Among the authors are Augustinus Isidore of Sevilla, Hugo Ripelin of Strasbourg, Gilbert of Poitiers, Wilhelm Peraldus, Honorius Augustodunensis, Thomas Aquinas, Albert the Great, Bonaventura, and so on. According to Audenrein, there was no important Latin work left which was not available at Armenian universities by the end of 14th and beginning of 15th century. For further reading on this topic, I have attached the link of my monograph for your perusal. You may find there interesting subchapters about Armeno-Latin intellectual relations. Secondly, the curriculum of first Renaissance universities, Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, was transformed and adopted in Galazor and Tatev universities. I'm not the first researcher who noticed these parallels. You may check, for example, the Raschel's work, The Universities of Europe in the Middle Ages. Similar to the semestral system in Europe and its handbooks, Summa Theologica and Sententiae from Petrus Lombardus, Gregory of Tatev composed several handbooks with names: Winter Handbook, Summer Handbook. It's meant naturally winter, summer semesters. Book of Questions. Reforms were undertaken also concerning the age of admission at the university, with the duration of studies, 7-8 years, defense of dissertation, and the academic titles. Similar to the magister and doctor titles, Johannes Orotnetsy and Gregory from Tatev set two levels called partial doctorate and full doctorate with their inauguration ceremonies. As a conclusion, these relations were enriching culturally and intellectually for both parties, but were destined for failure because times were competitive and hostile without the spirit of true ecumenism. But of course, they left a valuable lesson for all of us. Thank you for your attention.